Hey guys, this is my second video here to do with the 10.1 Mage hopeful changes, what I hope to see. This is specifically about Arcane. As you guys know, I'm a very prolific Arcane Mage player. I fancy myself pretty good at Arcane, raised in a pretty high-end guild with it. So I feel like I have a good understanding of this spec. And it should be no surprise to anyone that I love this spec, but a lot of people don't. And I definitely understand why they don't. A big part of this is to do with our ramp-up time, right? So hopefully in 10.1 Blizzard can look at this spec and kind of really consider what they want to be like Arcane's identity and what its gameplay should look like or feel like. I think it's completely understandable to have like ramp up time for Arcane. Our sequences should exist in my opinion, but I think that they're a little bit too like feels bad right now essentially. And I think this stems from two things. Firstly, I think that anything to do with like Radiant Spark timing is really bad. They need to just remove that. Like Radiant Spark having 10 seconds and 7 seconds when you cast your first spell is just terrible. I'm sorry. Like it does not need to be that punishing. Just remove it. Should just be like in no duration, just permanent. The other thing also is a little bit controversial, but I actually like the idea of like making Radiant Spark passive, and instead it should apply to your target when you cast Rune of Power, or alternatively have Rune of Power only be like a thing when you cast Arcane Surge or when you cast Radiant Spark. Effectively, my goal here is that you should get a Rune of Power when you cast Radiant Spark or Surge, so that we don't have to cast it before we cast Radiant Spark, because it just creates a weird, like an extra cast for no reason, right? In our AoE sequence, for example, right now, we don't even want to cast Rune of Power before a Radiant Spark, because there's no point. We're going to be buffing one ability. So we're going to be spending 2 seconds casting 2 spells that do no damage to do one ability that does some damage and then a surge. Like, that doesn't make sense. Even in single target, similar deal, right? You cast Rune into Radiant and then you start your damage. It just feels a little redundant, in my opinion, to have both these casts do nothing except set up these bursts, and yet they have a timer ticking the moment you're done their casts. So I think one way to make this a little bit more friendly is to just make Radiant Spark drop Rune and make Rune not a cast anymore. Like, it shouldn't be its own ability, right? Just have it drop from Radiant Spark. And alongside Arcane Surge, sorry. The other thing also is Arcane Surge cast time is really long, and that always feels bad. A lot of people complain about it. It's actually weird because there is a weird advantage to Arcane Surge having a long cast, which is when it's combined with Ice Flows. When you combine Ice Flows with Arcane Surge, the cast time of Arcane Surge is what allows you to move further to drop your new rune, and that feels really good a lot of the times. But also, I think that that's probably not worthwhile for how bad it actually feels. Conversely, it wouldn't actually feel bad if Radiant Spark didn't have a timer on it, right? I think that considering Arcane Surge is like this giant nuke, supposedly, it's meant to be this giant nuke, doesn't really feel that way, but it really feels bad casting, and I think a big part of that is because you know you're on this Radiant Spark timer. So potentially this Arcane Surge being a long cast time wouldn't be too bad of an issue if Radiant Spark didn't have a ticking time bomb essentially on it, right? So once again, removing the Radiant Spark timer would do wonders for this spec. Also, it gets rid of issues of like Harmonic Echo and Barrage travel time and like just a little bit of finicky stuff with Arcane that frankly is unintuitive and really like not beginner friendly for a lot of people. So yeah, I think definitely if I had to pick one thing to get rid of in this spec to make the spec more enjoyable, less punishing, and just not feel as bad is definitely Radiant Spark like timer. And also the ramp up time, like I said, with Rune. So definitely looking at some kind of revamp with Radiant Spark. If Radiant Spark was not part of our gameplay, then maybe the spec would feel okay. In my opinion, at least. In terms of the damage spread of this spec, I actually think it's perfect. Arcane Blast should be our top damage ability. We should not be casting missiles, right, without procs. With procs, it's good to cast missiles, right? It's where you want it to be. Nether Tempest could be potentially a little more like powerful because right now you only use it for Arcane Echo, which is a little weird to be honest. So maybe something to do with that. Reverberate is never played, which is also a little weird, but that's to do with Nether Tempest working with Echo. Once again, it's just too powerful of an AoE. Yeah. They on the PTR actually they did make a change to Arcane Barrage with how it cleaves. Basically, not to get into too much details, but Arcane Barrage has troubles cleaving on fights where a boss is really large and up in the sky. Think of like Senarth, Il'gynoth, Teros, Stormwall Blockade, things like that. They've actually fixed that so the barrage like cleave potential is like a lot better now and you will cleave a lot more. So for example, barraging Senarth will actually barrage the small spiders and the big spider now, which is fantastic. That was a great change, and I'm sure like in a Senarth for example scenario it will actually do more damage thanks to resonance. But our damage spread is at a good point right now. I think where your damage comes from and all that is really great. The only thing is just our ramp sequences and our Radiant Spark being as punching as it is feels really bad. Mana Gem is really cool, and I really like this ability, and I wish it was not just like its own build. I wish it was like an actual baseline thing. So I would much prefer if Mana Gem was actually somewhere else. Also, I'm gonna be honest, I think it's quite archaic that it's a 3-charge thing. Just make it a spell, like a cooldown, you know? Like, it's a 1.5-second cooldown. 1.5-minute cooldown, sorry. Just leave it at that. Like, we shouldn't have these charges and having to craft. I think that's something very archaic. And something that a lot of people don't like about the build. Yeah, just, there's no reason for it to exist. Just make it an ability. Maybe place it higher up. I think it would be cool to have it someplace like instead of like Mana Adept, for example. I think this talent is a little weird. It's like solves some mana issues that people have, but at the same time, Mana Gem kind of does that, but like better. So it seems a bit redundant. Foresight also seems a little redundant. Nobody ever picks it. There's no reason to ever pick it. Like Slipstream and Ice Lows kind of choose the same purpose. And then lastly, I really wish Chronoshift was obtainable, but right now it's never obtainable, which is also like it quite feels bad. Same with Improved Prismatic Barrier. Our talent tree in general is very like set in stone and it never changes. And that's a real shame. Like you change this talent here for this or this, or you know with impetus as well, whether you're single target AoE. But that's it. You're never taking Mana Adept. You're never taking Improved Prismatic. You're not taking Supernova. This ability sucks. Needs like a huge buff. It's straight up worse than Ice Nova in every way. So I don't know why it's there. I wish Chronoshift was takeable. Or Barrage actually has good use. I think it's a little slept on for like how good it is. It's not really like optimal in a lot of situations, but actually it's not as bad as you think it is. It's pretty good in M+ and AoE. I've never tried it, but the numbers showcase that it is at least. Harmony and Gem existing as 2 playstyles is great, but obviously I do, like I was saying, I do wish Gem was, you know, higher up here. One thing that could potentially be a little more interesting in my opinion is to kind of have some kind of playstyle that revolves around dumping our Arcane Barrage to be in place here with our Conjured Mana Gem instead. Because Harmony buffs our Barrage to be like more opportunistic, but there's no kind of playstyle inkling right now where cycling like your 4 Arcane Blasts into a Barrage is ever a thing for Arcane. That's just not the case. Even with Harmony, right? That's not your gameplay. So it would be kind of interesting to have something here. And I think like, for example, Rule of 3, Arcane Tempo, things like that, like these effects that give you bonuses based off your Arcane Barrage, it's like casting. I think that's really good. Some examples of what that could look like is like potentially like when you barrage, maybe you apply a debuff on the target, and then every time you know you apply that debuff, it like stacks up to like 4 or something, I don't know, and then your Arcane Blast damage is buffed for 5%. So basically you stack it up, and then for the rest of the time, the target is taking 20% more damage from Arcane Blast. Sorry, that would be cool. Something that increases the cast time of the initial Arcane Blast would also be interesting, instead of having to rely on Orb, because that does feel a little weird, I think. So maybe something there, potentially. Yeah, maybe even a choice node with Arcane Orb. I actually think that Rule of 3 and Arcane Orb could be a choice node instead of Arcane Familiar and Rule of 3. Yeah, but also, obviously, that would only work really. Rule of 3s instead of Orb, if you do have something that incentivizes you to barrage and actually not just rely on Orb. But I do wish Orb wasn't as much of a thing on single target as it is right now, but it is the case. But I think in general, just we want more fast-paced gameplay, a little bit like less wheelchairy, a little bit just more like on demand. Maybe a little bit more of a basic rotation even for some intro people. And just in general, Mana Gem higher, more accessible, ramps faster, So, Rune dropping from Radiant Spark, and Radiant Spark not having a duration would be insanely helpful for a lot of Arcane Mages, myself included, because it's very annoying when you lose your Radiant Spark. It's way too punishing for how punishing the whole gameplay is. Um, yeah, those are really my main points. I'm kind of jumping all over the place here, but yeah, I hope this maybe incites some people to want to play Arcane a little bit more, but right now it's just not there yet. I think a big issue with Arcane in general and going into next patch is that if you're really good with Arcane, Arcane is good. It's a good, very good spec if you're really good with it. But there's not very many people who are actually good with the spec because it's very, very hard to play. And so, why would you ever play the spec? Realistically, right? It's good on Raszageth and it's good on Dathia, but are those fights going to exist next year? Is it going to be a similar fight? If there is, you're going to be in a very similar situation where if you're a good Arcane Mage, it's great, and it feels amazing that you're the good Arcane Mage. But also, it feels really bad if you're not. And very, very frustrating. I've heard people saying they want to quit the game because they just can't grasp Arcane Mage, and it's it's so sad to hear those things. And the spec shouldn't be that punishing. And I think, yeah, things I've talked about, things I've talked about definitely kind of build up this issue that I hope they manage to tear down. I think the spec definitely needs a lot of looking at. Yeah, there's just a lot of things wrong with this spec, unfortunately. Even though I love it, I'd be okay if it didn't change, but obviously I'm a very, very minor population size. Um, but even if they don't change it, I hope they make some quality of life changes. I hope this video has been interesting, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.